and hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Hannah. And thank you to everyone for joining us. We're thrilled to be here with you all today. Big fans of Innovate US. Definitely check out all of the really awesome free content that they have available. We're so excited to be able to share the story of integrating human-centered design strategy, moving those ideas to implementation with a state agency. So again, I'm Judi Brown. I'm joined by my co-pilot here, Brittany Henry. We do have a couple of our clients joining as well, and that would be Willie and Heather, who are here. You'll hear from them in just a little bit, but Willie, if you want to say hello. Oh,
Willie, you're
on
mute.
Hello, Brittany, Judi, and everyone. Thanks for inviting us.
All right, and Heather?
Good morning and afternoon. Very excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that your voices are clear. We can hear you so that you can chime in on some of the elements here of this experience that we had together and continue to have as the Employment Training Panel in the state of California continues to implement HCD into their work. So before we get started, we are compulsive data collectors. So we're going to launch our very first poll here to get a sense of where everyone's familiarity of the human-centered design process is. This is actually going to give me some input as to how long I should actually talk about the process at the beginning before handing it over to Britt, who's going to explore more deeply the case study that we're sharing with you today. So Britt, if we could go ahead and launch that first poll. Okay. This is so fun. Data in real time. It's just a really wonderful thing.
I love watching it go. Okay, all right.
So for folks who may not be able to see the poll for whatever reason, maybe you're joining from a car, hopefully not, that's not safe, but the poll here is, we're asking about your familiarity with human-centered design. I'm a novice, tell me everything you know. I've heard the term, but not sure yet how to use it. I've been to a few HCD trainings. I've experimented with some parts of the HCD process in my organization, and my team and organization regularly apply HCD methods to our work. So pretty interesting spread here. We've got quite a bit. You want to go ahead and share the results, Britt?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and end the poll and share results.
Okay, so this is some good data. This tells us that this looks like we have a bell curve a bit here from 23% identifying as novice. Welcome, we're so happy to have you here. And another 27% on the other end of that bell curve, regularly applying human-centered design methods to your work. So what I love about this is that human-centered design is a process and a practice, right? So as practitioners, we're always learning about new ways to apply the process, new ways to implement ideas. I'm excited to see that we have some folks who are integrating trauma-informed approaches on the call. So please don't be shy about sharing your ideas, sharing some of the ways that you have found success and asking questions. As Hannah mentioned, we'll make some time at the end, but how this is going to work is I'm just going to give us a quick overview of who we are, why we're here, a little bit about what we do, a little bit about the HCD approach, and then we'll get right into how we have applied it in this particular case study with our friends and clients at the Employment Training Panel. So Britt, we can go ahead and stop sharing those results there, and I will get us into our slide deck. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody again. Super excited to be here. Thank you so much, Hannah, for inviting us. Thank you, Willie and Heather, for joining as well in the middle of an all-day training within your organization, which is pretty cool. So as folks continue to filter in, please feel free to use the chat, get to know each other, tell us where you're coming from. It's really exciting for us to do this at a national level, to hear from folks all the way in Florida to folks who are really close by in Sacramento. Again, this is me and Britt. We're here to help lead us through this session today. CivicMakers, as we mentioned, we're about a 10-year-old civic design firm. We primarily work with clients in and around Northern California. We do work all throughout the state of California, and we do work with some state agencies, which is our friends from ETP who we have here today. And these are some of the clients, as I mentioned, that we have the opportunity to apply human-centered, equity-centered approaches with. So a variety of municipalities, again, some state agencies. One thing that is unique about our firm is that 10 years ago, we actually started as a meetup. So we started in a very organic way, just bringing people together who had the audacity to reimagine how we might design public services with the input of those who will be impacted, not just in mind, but in direct collaboration. So some of the services that we offer are, I would say there's more traditional type services like strategic planning, some change management, organizational development, but really all of these are meant, are applied through a human-centered design lens. And I won't spend too much time on this because we have a pretty even distribution from novice to folks who have been applying this process. But one thing to really note here is that this is not linear. There's no such thing as a perfect step-by-step design process. Design is meant to be a little messy and a little uncomfortable because it is not how we have been taught to interact with decision making, and it's not how we've designed our institutions. So I know that our friends at ATP can share a little bit of some of the challenges that we encounter when we are reimagining how we collaborate both with our colleagues internally at our institutions and inevitably with the people that we serve. And really, one of our core tenets is that the process is as important, if not sometimes more important than the product, right? So if we are working on a strategic plan, for example, we're working with the city of LA on a 5-year workforce development strategy. It is more about the process to bring more voices to the table, to share power and resources, and to really highlight where lived experience shows up as it is what we end up creating. So what we're going to do is when I hand it off to Britt, she's going to share how we applied this process with the employment training panel along each phase. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, you'll get a taste of what each phase means here. I'm seeing a lot of chat activity. I think, Hannah, you're probably handling and responding to that. And Britt, just interrupt me if anything comes up. And okay, this is the last sort of circles, right? It's very circular, this work. These circles are really important to us because what they represent is at the middle of this Venn diagram is where innovation happens. We like to call this the public sector R&D. Of course, we don't have the luxury of having vast research and development departments within the public sector. In fact, the work that we do in innovation it's more difficult because we have to create programs, policies, products that serve everyone. And in fact, we have to keep in mind those who have the least amount of access and when possible, involve them in the design process. So that's where desirability comes out. Do people want it? Through the discovery process that Britt's going to share, through interviews, through some of the focus groups, through the ways that we even frame a problem from a user's perspective or from the perspective of people who will be impacted, that's where we get to understand, is this actually desirable? Do people want it? Then we want to look at viable. Can we fund it? Because we're talking today about ideation. We're talking about leading people through ideation sessions. Ideation is a fancy way of describing idea generation. It is a more structured way to do brainstorming. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we set expectations around what might be possible. So we want to look at a whole sort of universe of options and make sure that what we are proposing to change can actually be funded. And then on the other side of that is feasibility. Can we build it? So Britt and myself and our whole team, we use this desirable, viable, feasible framework for a lot of different, actually during quite a few different steps throughout the process. And again, they're all equally important, right? They're all equal sized circles, but really what the human-centered design process in government allows us to do is test this desirability. Do people actually want what we're proposing to create or change? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, our design strategist, lead facilitator, and all around amazing human being, Brittany Henry, who is going to lead us through the case study in applying HCD. Take it away, Britt.
So many titles. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a case study, which is a project that we recently completed within the last year. So we worked with ETP, and for the purpose of this, I will break down every single one of these acronyms that I'm going to use. So ETP is the Employee Training Panel. They are a sub department of EDD, which is the Employee Development Department of California. Sorry, do you have something?
Just Employment Development Department.
Employment, excuse me. And so ETPs is a mechanism that is used by employers within the state of California, where they can apply for funding to allocate those to different trainings for employees. And these specific trainings need to be outside of the core function, right? So think of trainings that would maybe lead to certifications, maybe some sort of specialization, really trainings that are ultimately to the benefit of the employee, not necessarily just the employer, right? And so they brought us on to look at, evaluate, and potentially redesign their application review process. They had done quite a bit of their own sort of like interviews with people and taken in feedback. And I think especially after what happened with the pandemic, and in terms of how that affected all government entities in terms of moving a lot of services to being strictly online and taking applications, they wanted to kind of look at their process and make sure that there weren't areas that they needed to revise. And so we were brought in to generate actionable discussion around what potentially could change. And one thing I do also want to note is that there was a capacity building portion to this. So we weren't just a consulting firm that got hired to do a bunch of research, spit out a report, and tell them what to do. We were brought on to work with an internal team to actually walk them through a human-centered design process, teach them that process, and at the same time apply it to an actual challenge that they were experiencing. And that is something those are the types of proposals we like to go for, because our goal is to become irrelevant. We don't want to be a necessity to our clients. We want to be a resource. We want to be a tool. We want to be partners to them, right? And so we really like to build the capacity. And so the process that is outlined here is that there was discovery, where we spent a lot of time just talking with people, having one-on-one conversations with stakeholders, both internal to ETP and also external. We're going to talk in a minute about when we think of stakeholders, who are we actually talking about, right? Because a lot of times people can think about just one type of stakeholder and miss other types of individuals or interested parties that they might want to engage with to really see the full scope of the problem. And then we moved into challenge definition, data analysis, which can be a very frustrating and intimidating part of the process. But I do want to give a huge shout out to our design team, which is about 8 different employees from across ETP, different departments, different levels, who went through this process, who sat in this design phase. And when we get there, we're going to talk about all that amazing work. And then we did an ideation session, bringing people together and really really generating a bunch of ideas, prototyping and testing, process recommendations, and then finally getting to implementation planning. And so I just want to note a couple of different things because I laid out this process, but what does that actually mean? Why is it in this order? I want to note that the first two parts, discovery and challenge definition, are the most critical pieces of this process. This is where we are ensuring that we are designing the right thing. So a lot of the project success really hinges on this part. And there's times where we can spend literally half of our time just in discovery and defining the challenge. It's that critical. And then if we go to next, we have ideation. And as Judi was talking about desirability and viability, that's where that piece of that Venn diagram kind of comes in. That's where we're really, really figuring out what do people actually want to do, and is it viable? Are we able to fund it? Do we have the resources for it? And then we get to prototyping and testing. And I will say sometimes this can also be an intimidating thing to talk about with clients because people have in their minds what prototyping and testing might look like. And we always do some education about what it could look like. And it doesn't have to be this incredibly in-depth in-depth process, right? But this is where we're testing feasibility. And we always encourage that there is some time to really test and make sure that your ideas are working for you. So that's feasibility. Go ahead.
I just want to call in this really great thing that Britt mentioned recently, which is myth busting, right? So like one of the myths that we do want to bust here is that prototyping is expensive, that it takes a long time, or that it has to look a certain way. And so as we get into sharing with you some of the prototypes that were created as part of this, we really want to drive that home that literally a prototype can be a drawing on a piece of paper, a representation of your idea that allows for somebody to more fully experience it. And why I'm calling this in is because in our experience in the last decade or so working with public agencies on integrating this process, the concept of prototyping can be really difficult to wrap our heads around. So just calling that in, Britt. Thank you.
And so getting us into our next part, again, as I said earlier, this was the project timeline. I do want to note that even though this project was scoped for a year, it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? It could be longer, it could be shorter, although we would highly suggest that you give yourself enough time. But I don't want you all to think that just because we've mapped a year here, that anytime you do some sort of human-centered design process, it has to be a year. This is the time that we and our clients wanted to give to this and thought that it would require. But the main point here I wanted to point out is that you see the amount of time we spent in discovery. We spent 5 months in discovery and challenge definition. And I think honestly that was longer than what we had initially even thought it was going to be. But just to emphasize how important those first two phases and what we learned from those first two phases are. And so I want to get into our first part of the process, which is discovery stakeholder interviews. And something to note about each of these different sections, we'll have a section focused on each phase of the process. There'll be a slide that outlines key activities, and really those key activities are important because there are milestones that get us to implementation. So just want to show you the components there, and then we'll always have an output. And at each of our phase, we're creating something, whether it's an artifact or something that our clients ultimately can use.
And you'll also see for our visual learners here that we do have our little HCD wheel up here. So it's going to show you which phase of the process each of these methods took place in.
And so usually when we come into a project, there's always a discovery phase. We usually are looking at documentation, but what we like to do as CivicMakers is talk to people. There's so much value that you can get from just having a one-on-one conversation, right? There's more things that you can learn than if you did a survey or if you just ask people to write something down. There's things like body language. There's certain things that people may feel safer conveying verbally than they would if through an email. And so that is a crucial part that we always try to make space for, is having conversations with people involved in the system. And so something that you'll note on these key activities is that we do have columns that say kind of what did we hold as the consultants, the third party, and then what did our design team help us co-design. And something to note on this particular slide is that you see for stakeholder interviews, we didn't have our design team participate in that. I think Heather sat in on a couple, and I'll invite Heather to speak about that in a second. But we together with our clients decided that for this work, it would add a lot of validity if we as third parties, people who haven't been a part of what's going on a day-to-day, were to have these conversations. And that's for a couple reasons. One, some of these things can be really contentious, and as some people can come with a lot of emotions, and talking to your colleague about that is a lot different than talking to someone who you're not going to have to continue to work with day in and day out after that. So this kind of ensured that people felt more comfortable giving us the TMI of what's going on. And that's the goal. We want to hear the frustrations, the pain points, and we want to hear what's going well. And so we decided that all of the stakeholder interviews, the majority of those would be conducted with just us, and we would basically go through the first process of saying what we learned. And the major output that came from this, if we can go to the next slide, Judes, was our process map. So what we decided early on, since we are looking at the application process, we should create a map of what that process actually is. When we were talking with our design team, they mentioned that a lot of different departments sometimes don't have an idea about what happens at certain stages, and through our interviews, a lot of people had no idea about how even an application is qualified. And so we threw one of our questions in our stakeholder interview protocol was, walk us through the application process from front end to back end, however you might see that. And from all those insights, we put together this process map. I do want to pull on Heather to kind of talk about her experience in this process, and in general, how were the stakeholder, because she did get to sit in on one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Britt. And I took some notes to kind of highlight my experience as a member of the design team. And so, the first thing I want to kind of point out about the stakeholder engagement and interview process is, as a state entity funded through tax dollars, it did become very important for us that we had a neutral third party who could interview both internal and external stakeholders for that validity, as Britt mentioned. That became, I think, very critically important for us because as we go through a process, as Britt mentioned, like if a colleague is interviewing you, or myself as a manager interviewing a subordinate staff, the responses are going to be different than if you have someone that is neutral. So that was really important for us. I had the pleasure of actually being interviewed by Britt and one of her colleagues. And I felt that there were a lot of really positive outcomes from that. And first and foremost was the ability for folks to be heard. And I think that when we are looking at the human-centered design wheel and we're looking at that empathize section, I think that that's what this process does really, really well, is meeting people where they're at and hearing what they have to say, whether it's good news or bad news or neutral. And that became really, really important through this process for us to really get some valuable feedback that maybe we didn't expect, right? Like that was one of my biggest takeaways throughout our interview process is things that we might not have thought of or would not have expected to hear through the interview process. So that was really fantastic. The other thing, so getting those ideas we didn't expect, but also allowing that honesty and transparency. And I think what was important for our design group is we were looking at both internal and external stakeholders. So where that became important too is allowing our external folks to feel heard, that we understood it, that we needed to improve a process, and their input was really critically important to us, particularly, again, state agency funding public dollars. So that became really important. The other thing, and I know Judi alluded to this a little bit, and Britt as well, was the importance of identifying the right stakeholders. This was like a really interesting process as a member of the design group, because Britt and Judi really pushed us to really think about who we wanted to interviewing those folks that maybe are the squeaky wheel that sometimes we think, oh gosh, do we want to interview them? Yes, we do. We want their input. So I found that as a really, really valuable part of the process. The other thing I just do want to mention that came out and Britt showed on the slide was the process map of our application process, which is quite complicated. But I really felt like the interviews and the work that we did with CivicMakers allowed them to really look very comprehensively at our process and build this like very confusing but like accurate and really incredible process map. So shout out to Britt. I know she worked really hard on that. But it allowed us internally to look at our process and say, whoa, we can make some improvements here. So that was really valuable visually to kind of map that out as we were hearing from internal and external stakeholders. So I really enjoyed this part of the process. We did spend a lot of time identifying stakeholders and making sure that we were talking with the right people. But I found it to be fun, actually. So that was sort of my experience. Britt, Judi, anything else you'd like me to chime in?
I think that's great, Heather. I do want to share for the folks on the call that one of the reasons that we saw so much success in this project in terms of ETP acknowledging that it's not necessarily just making the process easier for the end users or the people who are being served by it, but that the process presented an opportunity for them as an organization to actually be aligned on what's happening when, with whom. There is, those of you who were on the more practice side of HCD, you know that this does represent an opportunity for us to help shift cultures, and that often where, you know, Britt and our firm, some of the projects that we work on, our clients are really excited about embracing human-centered design for their customers. And we stand behind this not being possible to do authentically unless we figure out how to also do it with our colleagues. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to share this story with ETP and invite folks. So we did. Thank you so much, Heather. We'll call you back in, and you're welcome to chime in as things progress. But this was, as Britt mentioned, the output of the interviews. One tip that we want to share with folks is before you start an interview, if it's something that has to do with a process, ask the person to draw the process for you. And then you'll be surprised to see what you get. It's really helpful to visualize data. So with that, going from empathize, now we'll move into define. Go ahead and take it away here, Britt.
Yeah, and one other point just before we get into define, when we think about who is a stakeholder, right? Something that we encourage people to think about is to broaden that view and not just think about those who are receiving a service or being allocated resources. Also think about those who are administering it. Because if you're trying to solve a challenge with a process, you can't just solve it from the perspective of the person receiving the service, because they have no idea about all of the inner workings that it might take to deliver. And so you really do have to talk with your folks who are doing that process and doing that administrative work, because they are experts in that, and you can source the solution to whatever challenge you're facing through them and through your external stakeholders. So just to add that, because sometimes we do need to do a little bit of like shaping a view that our stakeholder pool is very large. And so moving on to defining data analysis, and I always like to preface whatever team I'm working with, I let them know beforehand, data analysis is going to be frustrating. You're going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be moments where you're going to get lost. And this is a process. You know, you're going to sit with this data, and you're really trying to make sure you're understanding, what are my interviewees telling me? What have they told me about this particular place, this particular system process that I am looking at? So again, these are our key activities. We had our design team walk all the way through it, all the way through this. And I'm sure Heather might be smiling. I can't see her face because I will put Heather on social media that this was definitely a part of the process that was frustrating. I cannot lie, but I'm really proud of the work that the design team did. And so what we usually do when we get to define is, one, we're taking all of the insights, all of the interviews, and we're combing through those and we're coding those, meaning that we're looking for things that can tell us more nuancedly, why is a challenge happening? What is happening? What are people doing, thinking, or feeling about what is happening? And we're coding that information. Then what we start to do is, usually we suggest doing an affinity map. This is one type of data analysis technique. There's other frameworks you can pull on, but this is where we usually start, by just coding our data and then mapping them to where are we seeing a challenge happen, and how many times do people talk about it? Because what we want to do in terms of thinking about designing for the right thing, we want to figure out critical mass of issues. Where do external and internal both have a problem, and where are they having it a lot? Because that might be where we want to start with designing, because maybe we can't do 100 different prototypes. I will say you can't do 100 different types of prototypes. So you have to figure out what is really important to focus on. And I'm going to pull on Willie to kind of talk about data analysis and like your experience as someone who was a part of our design team.
Thanks, Judi and Brittany. So first I want to talk about the interview process. What I want to add to that is, it was very important that we did have a third party to conduct the interviews, because when we were looking at the data analysis, we didn't want to associate a name that was with that comment. And having that third party, they scrubbed that information. So we didn't bring that bias into, oh, that person just might be complaining about this. So we just looked at, what does the comment say in and of itself, right? What we also did is we looked at, because we have different phases in our application process, we looked at a comment and said, well, this can apply to where? It can apply in this part of the process. It can apply in this part of the process. We didn't know the intricacies of the interview. So looking at that comment, our approach was to just say, if they're saying the customer can respond back faster, well, that can happen in any phase of the process. So we put that comment in each section. And I think that was helpful, because at the end, when we aggregated everything, we were able to say, all these common themes are starting to come together, and it gives us a little bit more focus on where we need to recommend solutions. Well, not solutions, but recommend things to maybe improve. I think one of the challenges that happened during the data analysis is that when people were looking at comments, they were trying to come up with solutions on the spot. And so we had to have conversations, multiple conversations sometimes, that took over multiple meetings to get through that, saying, look, I know we're fighting this urge to say, here's the solution to this, but that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is gather the data, hear what people are saying, and then figure out what may be the best pathway forward so that we still get involvement for everyone for the end outcome. So I think that's where we struggled a little bit. What I did like about the, if you can bring that data analysis map back up again.
Hold, please.
And then just to answer a question I saw in the chat that Judi already responded to, we use Mural and Dovetail for this process. Dovetail we use specifically for coding data, meaning like looking at a comment and assigning it like some sort of phrasing or word that kind of says what are we seeing here. And then Mural we used for this affinity map, taking all of those and like mapping them out.
All right. And I think what was helpful for us is that you guys provided the general definitions of what groupings you guys should look at, because in our discussions, we probably would have had a list of 25 items that we would have said, put this in this bucket, this bucket, this bucket, but it kind of gave us a little more focus. But in the end, I think it helped a lot because I think we ended up saying, okay, these comments fell in education, these comments fell in internal governments, and it allowed us to have a conversation internally about how do we move forward in regards to these things. What was also helpful is that we broke it up into what was said externally and internally during each phase. And that gave us that hindsight, that focus of what is happening through the process from their perspective, what is actually happening in our perspective. What this also did, I think, in looking at the data, is we had some aha moments, right? Going, okay, I didn't think about that. But it also gave us that opportunity to validate some assumptions that we thought about things. Right? We sort of knew it, but we didn't know for sure. But now we have people actually telling us about this. And I think what's most important, and this was said earlier, is that the data is coming from a variety of stakeholders. And in looking at that, we can come back to them and say, we hear you. We hear you. And I think that was one of the most important outcomes of this, is that people felt that they were heard.
Thank you so much, Willie, for sharing that. And yeah, this did sort of demonstrate again what we are really advocating for here, which is that, as Britt said, we're working ourselves out of relevancy, which isn't the best for like a small business, but in terms of ensuring that this is a process that lives on past our formal engagement. The filtering the data through the lens of us as a third party for the internal pieces gave us the opportunity to do what we do in user research, which is aggregate and anonymize. And then we gave it to our design team because they are the internal experts. We can only do so much with that data because we don't have the context of what it is to work day to day within ETP. And then the sort of capacity building part with the design team was helping them to learn how to conduct the interviews with external stakeholders. So we did those often in pairs. So Willie, I'm gonna unspotlight you, and then Britt, we're gonna launch a poll here before we get into the next couple pieces of the process.
And so I'm gonna launch our second poll where we just wanna see, have folks conducted stakeholder interviews? Have you done affinity mapping? So please respond. I will, as people are responding, I will also use this time to say that assuring some sort of protocol is happening with the data in terms of protecting people's unbiased opinions is really important. We are constantly building trust with our stakeholders throughout this whole entire process, and we try to engage them and let them know how are we protecting them through this, because it can be, you can be put in a vulnerable place if you're potentially saying something about someone else and maybe they have a position of power. So we always tell people in our interviews that the data that their data will be anonymized and aggregated before we share any insights out. We always, in our data analysis, we strip away names. You on that, if you could zoom in on that infinity map, you're not going to see anyone's name on there. You're going to see people talking about, I feel like this part of the process. But this way, we're sitting more with what's going on than who is being put on blast right now. So just to want to give that note about kind of data security there.
And Heather said it was so helpful for our design team to work to get out of our own biases. Thank you for sharing that, Heather. So it looks like we have a pretty, only 1%, or 1%, I should say. Yes, I have done both and they were not my jam. Great. I have done both and love the outcomes, 34% here, and then 47% has conducted one-on-one interviews, but did not do an affinity map. So that's really great to hear that the whole point of what Willie and Heather are saying is that people feel heard. That seems to be happening with folks who are here. Britt, I'm going to move us into the next few phases now. You ready?
Yeah, get it.
All
right. So at this point, once we get through discovery and define, we should be at a place of convergence where we are converging on this is what we're going to actually design for. And this is where we're going to start running downhill, right? Because we have all of this data, we have all of this new knowledge, and now we get to move on to the really generative part of creation. So the thing that we like to do is gather stakeholders, and maybe this is where we can even gather people that we haven't engaged with yet in the process, and we ideate. So what we like to do is bring people together in a room. For ETP, we were able to gather, I think, about 20 to 30 people into one room across department, across position levels, across in terms of seniority, into a room and say like, hey, here's what we've learned. Here are the challenges. What can we do about it? And the thing about ideation that's always really fun is it is literally about throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? And rapid generation. So in this session alone, we generated 250 plus ideas. Right, that's incredible generation. And what was even more impressive, in that same session, they were able to, as a group, prioritize 18 of those ideas as their top ideas. And we have some facilitation techniques that we use. Once we generate ideas, usually we'll have people go around and put a dot on what are your favorite ideas. And then the ideas that are getting the most dots, we take those ones and we plot them on an impact and effort matrix, just so people can get a sense of like, oh, wow, this would make a critical difference. And here's what the effort would take to get it. And all of this is going to help when we get to our next phase, which is prototyping and testing.
And Britt, one quick thing on the ideation session is we actually did a debrief with the executive leadership team recently about their experience of the process. And one of the key insights that came from one of the executive leaders was that being in that room with 25, 30 other colleagues and being able to actually hear all of the creative ideas, he said he learned a lot and that it was really inspiring. So again, when we talk about human-centered design and applying the process to some sort of tangible output that is perhaps finding ways to make our core service easier, more user-friendly, etc., we do also have the opportunity to change internal mindsets around where creative idea generation lives within the organization. So I just wanted to share that little bit. And Willie and Heather, feel free to add to the chat anything on your end. Go ahead, Britt.
And so ideation, we're seeing what's desired. What do people think are really good potential solutions to challenges that have been identified? Prototyping testing is where we get to try that out. And so what we like to do are usually low fidelity prototyping. So low fidelity is just can be a rough and dirty sketch. Here's an example of a low fidelity prototyping, right? It's some sort of visual that speaks to how could this potentially work? what are some building considerations? How might we consider implementing it, and what is the intended outcome? And then we gather people, usually stakeholders that maybe we've talked to and they spoke to directly, this being their challenge, like, hey, does this solve it? Would this potentially leave your challenge not a challenge anymore? And we get feedback, and we take that feedback and we iterate upon those, and then we consider it for implementation. And so we like to do myth busting around prototyping and testing, because it is something that you should be doing and can do. And it's not, as Judi was saying at the beginning of the session, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to require all this capital investment.
And one other thing about prototyping is we often are used to change happening, especially within state agencies, from a memo, right? Can I see a show of hands? Can folks relate to that? The memo coming through, that is what is basically saying what's going to change. And what this allowed us to do, thanks, Berenice, is that I love seeing the hands raised. What this allowed us to do was create a visual representation so that we could present this to other decision makers, and they don't have to like read through a memo, right? It speaks to different learning styles. It speaks to just giving people a vision of what's going to change, as opposed to reading it is. And again, a prototype can feel overwhelming because the origin of this process is that we do borrow it from the private sector. We do borrow it specifically from technology development. So we think about prototypes as something that folks are interacting with, but often it can be a storyboard, some sort of visual map. Even that process map that you saw during the discovery phase is a prototype, because we used it to test whether or not we got the data right. Back to you, Britt.
Yeah. And so now that we've done all of this good work, right? We went through challenge definition, we ideated and generated a ton of ideas, and then we shortlisted, and we ended up shortlisting to 5 ideas, right? So out of that 18, using the impact and effort, we brought 5 ideas for immediate prototyping and testing, which did that in a showcase with a broad amount of stakeholders, and then move those all 18 ideas into consideration for implementation. We are now at the part where all of our work should culminate into some sort of implementation planning, right? So figuring out kind of what is the timeline that we may want to consider implementing these in, and what's our near term, kind of like what might be, what ideas might take a moderate amount of time versus like what are those ideas that might take 3 or 4 years, right? And we scope all of that out. And our design team, because we couldn't have done that. Me and Judi couldn't have done that ourselves. Absolutely not. Right. Because we don't know all of the effort and like all of the coordination that actually has to go in. Our design team did all of this work, right? And we were just there to help facilitate it through. So we segmented out our ideas into like implementation pods, meaning that they should be these set of ideas should be implemented together because they make the most sense. And they also created a timeline on how long they thought it would take to do it, and when should these ideas potentially be implemented. And then they created a work plan. We are big believers in having your artifacts, your things you can look back at, because here's the thing, even if they decide to not follow exactly this timeline, the work plan tells you how to do it. It still gives you your milestones, right? So you can adjust that timeline because things happen within an organization. So creating a work plan can be really, really helpful.
And then we do want to invite Willie and Heather again to share anything about the implementation planning process before we do a little bit of practice, before we just open it to Q&A. Go ahead, Willie.
Yeah, I'd like to add that because during the implementation process, you also have to look at who do we engage to help us implement this prototype now, right? So it requires some collaboration now, but through this whole process and the implementations part specifically, it's a culture change, because the way ETP started, we problem solved in a different way of, we were always reactionary to something. Something happens and then we just make a decision and we put a Band-Aid on it and then we move forward. But what this process has done is sort of stopped us from using the Band-Aid method, but how do we approach problems in a different way that we actually come up with different outcomes that actually work? So,
Awesome. And then Heather, anything you want to add now that I've added you as a spotlight?
Yeah, just briefly because the timing is good for this. Willie and I have been sort of in our implementation and talking about some of the goals that we've met for some of the pods that we had to come up with during the CivicMakers process. And to Willie's point, I think that for the group that I'm leading, what's been the most valuable again are these ideas that I did not expect. That maybe for me, I didn't know made the most sense, but now in a broader context really do. The other thing that I think my group has done a really phenomenal job at, and I know Willie's groups are doing the same thing as well, is working across our agency to build long-term solutions. So my group is working on creating a new process. So we help in the process for the first year. And then after that, it's just built into the work that our colleagues do. But we are also building in ways that other teams can help support that work. So I'm really excited about that because it's work that was previously done a bit in a silo. We know how government works. So that's been really exciting as we are in the implementation phase of some of these ideas.
All right, great. Thank you, Heather. And Hannah, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. I'm seeing a few questions come through chat. I do want to be able to do a quick exercise. Are we okay with that? Can I see some thumbs from people? We want to do a quick exercise before we open. Maria, I see your thumbs. Thank you.
Just scanning to see thumbs. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay, great. Even folks who, oh, hi, Hannah. Hi, other Hannah that we know. Nice to see you, or at least your name on a screen. Okay, I'm going to give it over to Britt. We'll spend about 10 minutes going through this exercise with you all, and then we'll open it up to questions. There we
Big
go.
believers in having some applied practice within any sort of training that we do, just to give you the best way to learn is to actually do, right? So we're going to take some time and we're going to design an ideation session. Again, the design process is a series of collaborative decisions, and that includes designing sessions in which everyone's going to be in the same room doing something. If you're going to bring people together to creatively work on something, you should think about how to do that. So we're going to employ a series of Zoom polls and ask you all, our now fellow design researchers in this moment, to help us design an ideation session. And so there's different parts. When we say ideation, it's, as Nielsen Norman Group defines it, ideation is the process of generating a broad set of ideas on a given topic with no attempt to judge or evaluate them, right? We'll do that later. Right now, we're just go big, go broad. And so things that we consider in ideation prep, right? We think about, we need to identify the challenges and themes. We need to define challenge statements. So we need to think of phrasing. So that way, when we have people together, we can pinpoint them to what should they be thinking about solution-wise. And then we need to decide who actually should be at the ideation session, because everybody probably can't attend, but there probably should be people that we definitely include. And so here's our scenario, right? Our exercise scenario is Narnia has a problem. The grand state of Narnia has noticed that team members may be experiencing a communication issue. They have decided to do some research to figure out what the root causes may be and come up with some potential solutions. They conduct interviews with internal team members and some state-level partners and contractors to help them diagnose the problem. They then go through the process of analyzing their data using an affinity map. Through affinity mapping, they have found that there are a lot of issues with a particular communication channel.
Drum roll.
So Narnia has a problem, and it's Microsoft Teams, which probably feels really relevant considering what happened last Friday. Though I do know that Teams was like, well, either you appreciated this or didn't appreciate it. Was one of the few platforms that didn't crash on people on their workday, right? And so using affinity mapping, what our Narnians found out is that there is a lot of issues around Microsoft Teams. So if we were to read just 2 or 3 of those, right, we're seeing that people are frustrated by how difficult it is to add partners to teams when they are working with them on projects. People are saying, if I have an issue with Teams, I'm not sure who to ask for support. The communication team has actually developed a protocol for Teams, but no one knows, right? So the communication, they're seeing a statistical significance that Teams, there might need to focus on that particular platform and tool. And so our first prompt that we want you to weigh in on, right? Because we need to define our challenge. I want you all to pick a challenge to focus on. I will say for this one, there's no wrong or right answer for this prompt. I'm not going to say that for the next couple of ones, but for this one, I just want to see which one is more of interest to you all to work on. So from the below challenges, we want you to select the one that you would like to potentially ideate around. We're going to throw up a poll. And we just want you all to choose a challenge, right? So the first challenge is team members do not have a standard for how to use Microsoft Teams to communicate with colleagues and state agency partners. The second challenge, should you choose it, our team members are unsure of how to troubleshoot issues they encounter on Microsoft Teams. I'll wait till we get to about 80 people. I feel like we've consistently had 80 people participate.
Which is great. I love this engagement. Thank you all for participating. It is human-centered design, so we try to be among the humans here.
You all are humans right now. You're designing. Okay, I had a feeling it was going to be the one that it's going to end up being. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll as I think we've had a good amount of people weigh in, and I will share the results. It looks like you all would like to focus on the first one, right? Some team members do not have a standard for how to use Microsoft Teams to communicate with colleagues and state agency partners. Yeah, I agree that one seems like it has a lot that can come out of it. So the next thing that we would do, now that we've defined our challenge, right, is we would write an how might we statement. So we like doing how might we statements because it takes a challenge and it turns it into an opportunity, and it gives ideators like some inkling on what they might want to consider for a solution, right, without being prescriptive. So when you're creating your how might we statement, because there are good and there are not so good how might we statements, you might want to think about these things when you're creating that. Is it based on an existing problem or insight? If you have a how might we that has nothing to do with your theme, you might want to consider why that is happening and change that, right? We want to make sure that our how might we's are data driven. Does it center a goal that is desirable to those impacted? Is it something? Are we creating a how might we statement around something with statistical and qualitative significance? Is it written positively? So this one can be tricky because you don't want to write a how might we tell leadership how to do their job better. That is not a positive statement. And if you have a manager in the room ideating, that wouldn't make me want to help you, right? If you're sitting here telling me that I need to do better at my job, that's not a statement that tells me I should be a part of the solution. And then lastly, does it avoid prescribing a solution? I will say this is the hardest thing to do, is to make sure you're creating a how might we statement that isn't telling people that they need to do this, right? So you don't want to have a how might we statement that's like, how might we use a different platform than Teams? You're embedding a solution in that, right? You want it to be broad so people can kind of elevate and like create and go beyond what you would even expect in a solution. So we're going to do another poll. I've drafted 2 how might we statements, and I think it is just the very next one, Judes, that we'll be doing.
Yep.
Yeah. So I've drafted 2 how might we statements. What I want you all to do when I launch the poll is to tell me which one of these how might we statements is the better statement in your opinion, right? So our first statement is, how might we develop and disseminate information about Microsoft Teams communication norms so that team members understand best practices for interacting with internal and external parties? The second statement is, how might we educate team members about communication norms via Teams? So I'm going to launch this poll, and this will be the last poll that we do, and I just want to hear from you all about which one. And for some reason, Judi, I can't launch this poll. Can you launch it?
Let's see. Do I have the power here?
I don't. I don't know
Poll
why.
challenge 1. Oh, interesting. I do not.
Hannah, by chance, do you?
Let me see if I can.
Meanwhile, in the chat, if you want to put a 1.
Oh, wait, here we go.
Oh, you got it?
Launched.
Yeah. Go ahead and weigh in. Let's see. And this is where it's nice that it's anonymous, right? Because even if you get it wrong, no one knows. No one knows.
And we know some folks have to drop to other parts of their day. So I know that Hannah is going to send out some information, including our contact information if you wanted to learn more. Go ahead, Britt. Let's bring this poll home.
So we have 66% of people who think the first one is the better written statement. And then we have 34% of people who think the second one. And I will say, actually, Willie, Heather, which one do you think it is? You're on mute.
Number 1.
Yeah, right. Number 1. Why is that one the better one?
Because it doesn't have a solution in there.
It doesn't have a solution in there, and it's not as ambiguous, right? So when we see a how might we statement that says educate, it kind of makes our mind go, well, what are we educating around, right?
Exactly.
And so the first statement gives you more information to think about a solution, right? Like you understand when we say education, we're talking about communication norms. So because in our affinity map, what we saw was a lot of notes about, hey, I don't know what is the standard practice, right? And so that's we kind of give a nudge to our ideators that we really need to be thinking about communication norms. So spot on, everyone.
And to be clear, no shade to Microsoft Teams. You know, sometimes the tools are not really always the best for our needs, but sometimes we just need to put our creative problem-solving minds together to learn how we might use the tools at our disposal better to meet our needs. So, Britt, I'll just share these last couple slides and then we'll open it up. Go ahead.
And so in the chat, we're going to go through some tips, but what I want you all to do directly in the chat is just say, who would you invite to your ideation session? I'm just curious, as we've defined the how might we, the challenge, who do you think shouldn't be in attendance to this? So I want you all to drop those answers into the chat. And as you're doing that, I'm going to go through some tips that you might want to consider, that you should consider bringing into an ideation session. So we usually display these at the beginning of a session. We would say go for quantity and variety, keep the energy high. This is a really fun, generative activity. We like to bring out our extroverted personalities because it is about getting a lot of ideas. We defer judgment. Just because you don't like someone else's idea, you don't have to say that, all right? Stay more curious. Ask questions about like, I wouldn't have thought about that. What makes you think that solution is a good one? And be visual. If you want to draw something out, we really encourage letting that inner child come out during the ideation session. Recognize patterns, imagine the impossible. So things that you wouldn't have thought because, oh, the budget's not there, or I don't have the people. this is the time to think about those things. We'll prototype and test later, and then encourage and build on wild ideas. I think in our ideation session, we did a practice, and Judi came up with carrier pigeons. And I was like, that's an idea. we put it up there, right? We know that carrier pigeons is not going to work, but you know, we are deferring judgment about why that came up. And then in terms of evaluating your ideas, right, you do a viability test. We talked with executive team members to get some funding considerations. And then you want to think about feasibility. And that's where you're really doing your prototyping and testing. So once you go into ideation, you're going to want to apply some sort of evaluation to those ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Britt. Thank you, everybody. I do want to respond to a few of the comments in the chat here. And I'm also going to put us on gallery view so we can see each other. We can all see each other now. Little boxes. Some have names, some have face. Mina. Hi, Mina. Hi, Hannah. So I do want to respond. Thank you all for the engagement here. I'm seeing some chatter in the chat about who we want to invite. So I love the idea of that we want open-minded people in the room. I also really want to encourage you to include the people who you think are going to have the greatest resistance to participating in the ideation session at all, and to actually acknowledging that change needs to happen. And the reason for that is because oftentimes, if we get everyone in a room who is 100% bought in to having everyone across an organization who touches some sort of process in a room together, it actually can create a little bit of groupthink. And we miss some of those really important insights that can be surfaced when folks who we might assume are not quite open-minded would have. Britt and I love to have the skeptics in trainings on projects. When we have sort of like a leading team or a project team or a design team, we want that to be representative across the organization, because the reality is that we may not be able to bring everyone along, but we do want to create the space where people feel like they've been included. That allows us to, if we are running a transparent process, we lead with the process. And eventually, hopefully people will come, but I will tell you that they will be grateful to be invited. I love the Microsoft developers. Could the silly ideas maybe also help encourage quieter team members to participate? Yeah, Trudy, the whole carrier pigeons thing was hilarious. And what it created was what we call a cultural artifact, right, Willie and Heather? Because we refer to it. And then that takes us back to that place where we got to all be in a room. Play is an important part of this.
One thing I do want to, because we have had folks who are more on the introverted side, and I will say your onboarding for them is really important, right? We like to spend the first half of our ideation session making sure that we walk through what we did and how we learned, because it gives folks who maybe are the people who need to think about things and want access to all the information before ideating. We're providing that context to them in time or in real time. So just also think about that, of what is happening. What are you doing to make sure your ideators are well informed so that they can ideate?
Hi, can I add on to that? It is important because when dealing with the group, usually the members are people who have not had a voice and how things work. And so it's trying to engage them and get them to speak up a little bit more into this process. So it is important for that to happen.
So we do want to make some space. Hannah, I'm not sure if you want to help be our sort of moderator here, but we have not Hannah Redden, Hannah Hetzer. We do have a little bit of space here to just chat if you all have specific questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Judi, Brittany, Willie, and Heather. That was fantastic. I'm going to take us off recording.